Hello and welcome back to this episode of the Blue Lineage podcast series. On today's episode, we're going to discuss R&B further. Up until this point, we've been working our way up, and a lot of the artists would be categorized in the jump blues and beginning of the rock and roll category, early R&B. We will also be discussing a couple more DJs, the last radio DJs on our list, and kind of how that's built up to this point. And since they're our last DJs, we'll also talk about the overall contribution of Black DJs to not only the music industry, but also to some of the development of actual genres like hip-hop, specifically. And then we'll talk about, we really get into actual R&B artists. It's kind of made the full conversion now to R&B, and we'll get into that, as well as there's still some continued overlap. We'll get into it. As we'll discuss, the R&B genre itself is a little bit, in some ways, is industry created, as is rock and roll. And even though there's a clear sound that makes up R&B and rock and roll, you can kind of see, as we'll discuss, why you can kind of pick and choose, or it doesn't necessarily follow. It's not necessarily consistent as when what is termed R&B, as we've kind of already discussed, and what's termed rock and roll, and then the following genres as well. It kind of gets a little bit murky. And so I think really for the past couple episodes we've kind of been in some murky waters, trying to, we've discussed what might be the first rock and roll song, what might be the first R&B song. But now once we get into some of these artists we'll discuss today, it's when you hear it, when you listen to their music, it's like, oh yeah, this is what I would consider R&B and maybe rock and roll. But it's pretty clear cut at this point as far as I think listeners are concerned. So to start off on the timeline, we start with, on the terminology side, there is the two items are about sort of the industry shift from what was being labeled as race music to R&B. So first on the list, you can see it talks about how RCA Victor, which was RCA, the RCA company, RCA Victor specifically would refer to, at the time, records, vinyl was still the primary form of medium used to consume music. And of course, radio is becoming bigger and bigger, so in a lot of ways, people were using radio as a primary consumption at the time. But really during those times, because of, the limitation of, radio was still limited as far as the ability to, play endless amounts of music and to maybe play the music that you wanted to hear, or, be more single-oriented as it really always was. It was a form of promotion, and that's really what radio has always been. But I think at some point, radio became so prevalent where a lot of people only consumed radio, especially with the mobility and the ability to take it wherever you went. And so at this point, people are still primarily consuming their music through records, but they may have been first exposed to the artist by the radio. RCA changes their marketing term from race music to blues and rhythm in 1948, and as we sort of discussed, race music was a term that was used way back in the 1920s, starting with one of our first artists, and it was supposed to basically be black music, or black artists making music for black people. And, that was more or less true. Obviously the reason that it's being changed is because at this point, what is becoming R&B and what is R&B has expanded far beyond just the black community, even though it's consistently been this whole time the primary consumer. But now, people, you don't, as a marketing approach, you don't necessarily want to be marketing race music and you have a large white audience buying these albums, because now all of a sudden there's kind of a marketing conflict. You want to brand it in a way where it's open to everybody, and you're not just having white people consuming what's termed race music, because obviously back when they first created the term, race music was a clear delineation. It's like, oh, you know what this is. This music was apparently made by black people for black people, and that was a way for the industry to market that to black people, because at the time they thought that that's who would be interested in. They didn't really think that the white audience would consume it the way they ended up consuming it, at least during those times. And now times have changed to the point, especially with radio, where it's just a much wider audience is consuming it. Even though up to this point, white audiences were involved the entire time, but now it's just gotten to a point where it's kind of becoming a market conflict. And then around the same time, the industry really also adopted that term, specifically on the list as Billboard. And actually, Jerry Wexler was the one who is given credit with coining the term rhythm and blues. And Jerry Wexler is known as he was a writer for Billboard, but he was even more well known for producing Aretha Franklin later on, and I guess turning around her career more or less. And he produced some other artists as well. So yeah, that's the thing about R&B, as you can see, and that's the reason it's on the timeline, is because the switch to the term R&B was industry motivated. It's not necessarily what artists were calling it. I think with many of the terms, they may or may not have been already used by the artists and the communities who consume the music, but the primary switch was industry related. For Billboard, it was more of a political thing, as far as seeing the term race record or race music as being outdated. But once again, I think to some degree, it was marketing / optics, and not necessarily the recognition of the evolving musical form. So it's just something that's interesting to take note of, and it'll be a reoccurring theme throughout R&B and rock and roll. It already has been, as we've discussed with some of our previous artists talking about jump blues, and as we kind of move through the timeline, how some of those songs sound a lot like R&B, and some of them have rock and roll elements as well. So something just to keep in mind, and further expanding on that, just looking at the R&B charts and how they kind of evolve, specifically with Billboard. I think it's a pretty good indicator, because I think when you talk about genre, all of the genres have not only like the musical structure, but there's also a cultural component and what, how people view, at least especially from the industry perspective, how people view the people who they think are going to consume the records. So that kind of all plays together. But I think specifically in this case, when you look at the R&B charts as they've evolved on Billboard, kind of just shows you, it just makes you think about genre, I think, because I think a lot of times, especially, nowadays when there are so many genres and different categories, people will say a genre as if they're defining, a certain type of music, and historically I think sometimes we don't think about how those genres, each genre was kind of delineated or separated and put into a category, and that's one of the primary reasons, it is a reason why the timeline is structured in the way it is, and why there's a specific emphasis on like the blues as being the foundation, because as we move forward, the blues was really a term, used by the community and by the musicians, and it was labeled by the industry as race music. So now, you're not necessarily acknowledging the blues name at any point to a certain extent. Now you're kind of saying rhythm and blues, so it's in there. But now we're really getting into industry labels. Now that it's been brought from, originally the rural blues was, originally a very rural musical tradition, and, moved into cities, urban atmospheres, and that's also where, the industry resides. And so all of a sudden, it's becoming a bigger and bigger business, and, getting more and more popular. So now the industry has shifted from race music to calling it R&B, and it's not necessarily what the creators of the music would have named it, and it's not necessarily, recognizing a clear shift into R&B, the sound. That's why, with rock and roll, it's all created retrospectively as far as people, there's just, they're like among the music aficionados, or, people who are really into it. When you talk about rock and roll, there's like a huge list of songs over the history of like which is the first rock and roll song, because there's different elements of rock and roll. People will say like back to the 1920s even. I think once we get on our timeline, I think it's in the 1950s as far as what we consider rock and roll. I think it's pretty clear cut by then. But I think part of that whole battle is just, it's, if you take a step back, it's kind of like, and the reason we focus on the timeline, the blue lineage is called the blue lineage, is just because the blues was intentional, and then as you take a step back, it's almost a natural evolution, this whole growth into what we get to in the end of the timeline, which is hip-hop. If you just recognize it from a cultural and musical perspective, it's almost a natural evolution into what it became, versus kind of the industry kind of categorizing it and doing what it wants to market music as time goes on. And when you look at the R&B charts, it really, I think, highlights this. And so early with Billboard in the 1930s, what over time evolved into the R&B and hip hop charts. It started out as the Harlem Hit Parade. That was the first label that people will ascribe, that continued to evolve into what we know as the R&B hip hop charts today, which was specifically, the Harlem Hit Parade was specifically referring to Harlem at the time, and just because in Harlem, which was also where Tin Pan Alley was, which we talked about very early on, and so that whole area was just a place where music, the industry was thriving in general, and And, you have to think about during that time with the limitation of communication between cities and the United States in general, the big markets are going to be the market that kind of defines everything. And so in this case, in New York, you have Harlem, and that was where, for the Black or African American music scene, everything was really evolving, and there's a significant presence of just artists in general, including music. And so the Harlem Hit Parade chart, was the first kind of iteration of charting and documenting, what was a hit at the time. And then after that, it moves to race music or race records, as we've talked about. Now on Billboard, race music started first being released as race music back when we first talked about W.C. Handy and Mommy Smith. But Billboard didn't really take that on until 1945, which was only like a short while before it switched over to R&B. So from 1945 to 1949 we have race records, and then in 1949 or 48, as we just talked about, they added our rhythm and blues charts, and then it switched to rhythm and blues sides, and keep getting various, between cycles between hot R&B sides and singles and different names, until we get to 1969, where it switches to best-selling soul singles. And of course, soul is people will consider soul differently. Some people will consider it as like a specific sound, closely related to R&B. Some people will consider it as a specific influence of gospel on R&B. A lot of gospel singers came over once R&B really got going and became very successful, and they were more so considered to be soul singers. Some people just consider that time period of R&B as soul. Some people just consider soul as a subgenre of R&B, which is like one of the main reasons why soul isn't on the timeline, is just because, R&B really encapsulates it. A lot of subgenres could have been included within the timeline, but we try to stick to pretty core, the core genres. And so we have the best-selling soul singles, we have hot soul singles, and then in 1982, the chart switched to hot black singles. And so, it's just important to keep in mind, kind of this transition and evolution of the chart. You're kind of going from race records, and now we're back to hot black singles, which, it's very race-based. And so the whole evolution of the chart, it's almost as if it's sort of we know who the audience is, and we're just changing sort of these placeholders as far as what we're going to call it. And then so in 1990 it switches back to hot R&B singles, and then finally in 99 it becomes hot R&B and hot and hip hop singles and tracks. And so, at that point, it's interesting, it's 1999, because hip hop is, has been developed and been popular for a while now. It's well into the existence of hip hop. And so, once again, just like with R&B, you can debate what the first R&B track is. You can debate what the first rock and roll track is. I mean, at this point, in 1999, I think everybody, it's a different world at this point, where, a genre doesn't necessarily need the validation of the industry to be, be called what it is. And hip hop kind of was defined by the artists and community who made it. Hip hop is a whole culture. And similar with funk, we'll talk about funk later, but funk kind of gets glossed over a little bit. but even though it's the foundation of hip hop, it's that's something we'll get into. It's interesting discussion, but the point of it is just to look at how the R&B charts, or however you want to call it, evolved into the R&B and hip hop charts, and just taking notice that it's not necessarily, when we talk about genres, it's not necessarily that these artists came and were creating new genres. It's more so that music was evolving naturally, and then people were kind of naming it as it became commercially viable. Another area you could talk about is the Grammys in reference to genres. I mean, I think the Grammys, is kind of messy, because with the Grammys they're bringing in like a committee, and so it gets really political. So not only do you have genres and genres and all these different subgenres and categories, but you also have a committee, so things get altered there as well. And I know with the Grammys, they also have, I don't know if they still have the urban categories, but you get into the same thing basically. It's just a little bit more convoluted, in my opinion. I don't really pay close attention to the Grammys anymore, so I can't really comment on it in depth, but it's just, when you just look at these placeholders or categories, it just, it's something, it's an interesting discussion, something to think about, especially as we move through the timeline. There'll be more instances where we see music that kind of sounds like maybe it could be in a different category, and then we're seeing music that kind of exists before it's supposed to exist type situation. So that was just an important note, I think, as we begin to enter into what is kind of the acknowledged time of R&B, and why, the history of that and the evolution of genres. So first on the list for artists, or DJs, I guess in this case, is a DJ. It is Nat D. Williams. And Nat D. Williams he's from Memphis. He was also known as the Voice of Memphis. And he was, and one thing I will note that is interesting is that a lot of the artists / DJs that we had talked about up to this point, so many of them, we focus a lot on the migration, the Great Migration, and the Second Great Migration. So now, as you kind of seen, this is a process that has been taking place for a while now, and you can see that in Nat D. Williams' case specifically, he was born in Memphis, which is obviously a city, and so many of the previous artists, most of the artists, I think T-Bone Walker was born, I think he was born outside of the city, and I think he moved to Dallas. So many of the artists were born, like on as sharecroppers. Their parents were sharecroppers, or they're born onto plantations in rural areas, and now you will see more artists who are just born in the city. And I think something just to pay attention to is how that kind of shapes their trajectory and kind of the influences that they have, being born right into a city center. And then of course, these are times where African American communities were having a tough time, as many African Black communities and cities still are. But at the same time, it was a time where there was a lot of opportunity and a lot of families were thriving. And that was the case with Nat D. Williams and his family, living in Memphis, specifically the Beale Street area, which was a thriving Black community at the time. And so he so his parents were pretty successful, and that was kind of one of the and successful in terms of city life, and that kind of I think set him up a little bit better in a lot of ways than some of the previous individuals on our timeline. It's not a universal statement. There were definitely other individuals, I guess, speaking specifically about W.C. Handy and Louis Jordan. But I think, it's somewhat undeniable that if you come up in the city, and you have some success, or your parents have some success, that, just because of the opportunities that are already present in the city, you get a good opportunity to, kind of take a different trajectory than some other people who might, have moved to the city in their adult life, and kind of what they had to do in their trajectory. Once again, not a universal statement. Just because you're born in the city doesn't, mean you necessarily have a leg up, as we've talked about, and as we will talk about. There's a lot of struggle in the city as well, but just a different atmosphere, a different starting point. But in Nat D. Williams' case, he went to Columbia University, and then he went to Northwestern, I think for his graduate degree. He was working as a editor and journalist after school. He specifically worked for the Memphis World, which was a publication in 1931. And, with his educational background and just his natural creativity and way of looking things, he was really able to kind of hone his craft and mix politics with humor and kind of shape that. And that kind of set him up really well to become a DJ. And, as we kind of talked about previously, newspapers and radio, as it was for everybody at the time, those were the primary mediums. But for the black community specifically, now, there were ways to really directly connect with the community in ways that, just were not possible before. Especially in urban centers, if you don't live in a city, it's hard to, even for newspapers to distribute, to mass distribute something to the community. Radio kind of changes that. But in the case for Nat D. Williams working at the Memphis World, he definitely took advantage of being able to, kind of build up his reputation and platform as a writer first, working in the Beale Street, Memphis area. And he also started to work as an MC. He MC'd at the Palace Theater, and that's where he was able to hone those skills as well as a DJ. So in Memphis, there was a radio station called WDIA, and they had just started, and they were struggling to, really break into. They were struggling to have any success. They started playing country and Western music, and that was really working out. And so they, kind of, looking around them and realizing and seeing, the rising popularity of, the black community, the black radio market. We talked about Al Benson last episode in Chicago, and, he had a lot of success. And seeing that, they wanted to try to break into the black radio market. And so they hired Nat D. Williams, and they decided to switch their primary music to R&B. And of course, as we just talked about, R&B was an all-encompassing music for black music at the time, or R&B was an all-encompassing term for black music at the time. Which was really just, would have just been mostly what was either jump blues, R&B, or blues. and gospel. And Nat D. Williams became the first black DJ in Memphis, and I believe he was the first black DJ below, of the South, essentially, in reference to the Mason-Dixon line, which is basically, the South. So he started out there with an evening program. One note is that we'll talk about later, but B.B. King also worked as a DJ at WDIA. And, his success, Nat D. Williams' success, led them to hire other black DJs, and they became the first all-black DJ radio station at the time. It wasn't, well, we'll talk about that later, the first black-owned radio station, but they were the first all-black DJ radio station. That was in 1949. So Nat D. Williams, he caused a little bit of controversy just because, as we discussed, he had formal education in journalism, so he was pretty well versed as far as pulling politics and integrating that to his work as a DJ and infusing humor. He's a very popular DJ, and because of that, when he would talk about various political and social issues, it caused a little bit of a stir, just because they were not necessarily the popular mainstream areas of discussion, especially being in the South in Memphis. There was definitely a lot more racial tension. So there was, he got hate calls and threats, different retaliation, and some of it was around the music that he was playing. A lot of music for the time, R&B music for the time, was seen as having vulgar and just inappropriate, sexualized, just content that was frowned upon by many people. And so a lot of it was that, and some of it was just the social issues he talked about. He also talked a lot about African American history, just going over some of the recent history and some of the pioneers, and the evolution of black culture up until that point. And he talked about the news, different social topics, as I mentioned. He had a program that was called Brown America Speaks, in which he talked about the civil rights movement, talked about police brutality, and other political issues, and that caused controversy. I think the main controversy was around the music. Certainly talking about the civil rights movement, police brutality, was definitely something that was, a little bit more of a progressive stance and not appreciated by as many people. But I think the music was something that people, specifically because it was something that permeated, just American culture in general, and a lot of people saw it as a threat, just because of the things I said before, as far as some of the content of the song, which, once again, as I mentioned before, if you listen to the songs, it seems very mild, but I think it, kind of relates it to some of the hip-hop or rap music, of today, as far as, some of the controversy that has surrounded that over the evolution of hip-hop. Can go back to blues, as we talked about before, and similar controversy comes up as far as content. So it's just a recurring theme as new genres within black music come out. It's usually met with some form of controversy, and in Memphis, specifically in response to Nat D. Williams and WDIA, there was a point where actually police broke into black-owned businesses and were destroying records that, you know, were by the artists that were being played on the radio. You know, records by records, you know, the same music by various artists who would have been played on the radio, just because, you know, as I said, there was a concern of, you know, this permeating culture, and specifically black-owned businesses. Because there are businesses, there was, you know, there was a little bit more gray area as far as what actions you could take to, you know, break into a business versus breaking into homes. And I think black-owned businesses, of course, were more symbolic, and more, they were, you know, symbols of black progress in general, and you would, it was assumed that, you know, somebody who was a black business owner in a lot of cases is kind of within this whole larger movement of, you know, pushing for social and civil rights and moving up, you know, in America, moving up economically. So, you know, that was a continued thing. But overall, you know, for Nat D. Williams, he was, you know, well liked, very popular, and, you know, as far as the radio broadcasted, so around Tennessee and nearby cities that it would have reached, which would have been, you know, a number of the cities, urban areas that were kind of near to that Mississippi River region. So that's Nat D. Williams. You know, we talked about Al Benson already, and now we have Nat D. Williams, and of course, way back we talked about Jack L. Cooper. But all these guys were just important figures in the evolution of, you know, Jack L. Cooper, of course, specifically was very important for the evolution of radio and music being played on radio in general. And of course, black radio, which is, became a thriving field because of these early DJs, and it was also very important to get the music that wasn't being played prior out to communities, so it could be consumed, and you know, largely responsible for the continued growth of these genres that we're talking about. Oh yeah, one note that I missed as I'm looking at my notes is, you know, to sort of appease the negative concerns about the music, Nat D. Williams would like either laugh or talk over some of the inappropriate parts of songs as a form of censorship. So, you know, that would have been like the first form of, you know, what if you listen to the radio now, or, you know, a lot of different, you know, CDs or, you know, songs, however you consume your music, that would be, you know, the equivalent of people either like beeping out certain lyrics or phrases, or, you know, just inserting different words into it. So, you know, that was just the times. You know, he was well liked. I think, you know, definitely more positive than negative. But at the same time, you know, especially being in Memphis and being in the South, you had to, I think, navigate some of the political and social issues a little bit more carefully. Just because, as we talked about, you know, some of the repercussions were a little bit more severe in a lot of cases. So the next artist on our list is Joseph Deighton Gibson Jr., also known as Jockey Jack, also known as Jack the Rapper. Jack the Rapper is, the most recent name he would have gone by, so maybe that is probably maybe the more likely name that you may have heard of. But I'll refer to, as I'm talking about him, I'll refer to kind of the name that applies to the time period, so hopefully that's not too confusing. But he was born in Chicago. His mom was a teacher, his dad was a doctor, and so sort of similar to Nat D. Williams, there was an expectation of university. I don't know if Nat D. Williams was expected to go to university, but in this case, Joseph Deighton Gibson Jr., he went to Lincoln University, and he was more interested in performing arts, which is not exactly what his parents were wanting him to do, but that was his interest, so that's what he did. And in the 1940s, he acted in what was the first all-black soap opera, which at the time would have been on radio. It was called Here Comes Tomorrow, and it was on WJJD Chicago. And this was also, WJJD Chicago was also where Al Benson was broadcasting. And, this that kind of led to other broadcasting gigs, and eventually his friend's father was, he was familiar with the broadcasting business. He wasn't a broadcaster, and he was interested in buying a station, a failed station in Atlanta called WERD. And his friend kind of reached out to Joseph Deighton Gibson and was invited him, as his father purchased WRD, to be a broadcaster, since he had experience in it. And so he broadcasted at what was now the first black-owned radio station, and along with his friend, he started DJing there as Jockey Jack. And that station became really well known for playing the top hits by black artists. As we mentioned with Al Benson, there was a time period where broadcasters were able to choose the songs that were played on the radio. So this was during that area for a little while. And one of the things with Nat D. Williams, Al Benson, and Jockey Jack was just this whole growth of black radio was big, just because of the hits. They're playing music that wasn't previously played, but also just the kind of appeal of the black DJ was really unique to the market. Number one, you were able to connect to the black community in a different way, in a more effective way, that just hadn't been done before. You're playing music that is culturally relative. You're also talking about issues that are culturally relative, and in addition to that, it was popular in white communities as well, or just mainstream America, just because just offered a new angle. There was just a lot of, with black DJs, there's just a lot more the cadence, the wit, just the whole approach to radio was not all that different from black music, in which a lot of humor, wit, the whole style was completely different, and to a lot of people was more engaging and exciting, and so a lot of people tuned in for that reason as well. And that was how kind of black radio transcended just the black community, and as a whole helped black music become what it is today, as well as just really popularizing black music and the culture at that time. So Jockey Jack moved to multiple different radio stations. He made a big name in Atlanta, but when he went to Louisville at WLOU, he became even more, and he really laid into the Jockey Jack persona, and kind of transcended the radio station at that point. And that's when Jockey Jack was really known as Jockey Jack, and so that really opened it up to just as this is happening, black radio is really getting bigger and bigger, and so him being a bigger than the black radio or market really helped him to progress his career, and he moved to some other stations in Miami. He was able to become a program director of the station, and after that he went back to WRD in 1954, and this time he was returned as a program director, and at the same time the civil rights was becoming a bigger issue, and so he focused a lot more of his attention during that time to social activism, in addition to continuing to expand WRD and his audience, or their audience. So he highlighted a lot of social issues and just issues that were occurring in black neighborhoods. Black radio at the time, specifically in the case of WRD, because it was located in Atlanta, which had a pretty thriving black community. The black radio offered a unique way to highlight issues in a mass way, reach the masses, and kind of all at once kind of coordinate a response to certain things that might have been going on in a black neighborhood, or highlight injustices or concerns. This was a time where radio was big, but of course it's not like today where some radio stations are syndicated across the entire nation. In this case, it's big. You're able to reach a pretty large population, but it's still kind of a community situation in which I know there are, one example is in some cases if the community came to the station or called in the station and said so and so is struggling this month to pay their rent, people would come together and pool the money and get people's rent paid. So black radio was really a tool, and it was definitely a tool that evolved and was utilized in the civil rights movement as well, besides just putting out and expanding black music and promoting that. And so, speaking of the civil rights movement, his station was right next to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was, MLK's headquarter office, or one of his offices. So, that was also used as a tool. The radio station was, if he worked with Martin Luther King, and also, if there was a sudden announcement or something, that needed to go out right then, Martin Luther King or members were able to just kind of pass that over to the radio station and make that announcement immediately. So that was a huge plus, and also, a big tool in the civil rights movement. So, Jockey Jack's career, really spans way beyond all the way through the timeline, basically. And so he not only was a DJ and a program director, also contributing to social issues and civil rights issues. He also put a lot of his time and focus into just developing black radio, eventually, television as well, but, black industry, and trying to kind of expand that, support future professionals who would be in the field. And it started out with him starting the National Association of Radio Announcers, which became the National Association of Television and Radio Announcers, when it was appropriate. And his intention was to really to support black announcers, and it was made up of some of the most influential DJs during that time. And then in 1963, he moved on to Motown Records. He was in public relations for Motown Records. He had some similar gigs at some different record producers. And after that, he in 1976, he turned his attention to more commentary. He started writing a newsletter that was called Mellow Yellow, and that was a publication where he started to use the term Jack the Rapper. And, just in a reference of time, Jack the Rapper, that was right around the first beginnings of what would have been considered like potentially the first hip-hop or spoken word type movement. 1969 was pretty early on, but that's not, Jack the Rapper is not in direct reference to that, but culturally you can see how things are naturally evolving into what would soon become the early forms of hip-hop / rap. So he used his platform or his newsletter to, he's really outspoken about a lot of issues that he saw in black radio. Of course, coming up and being a pioneer of his time, he experienced a lot of things, saw a lot of things, and as we talked about with Al Benson, later in his career, the industry was kind of, really, throwing around its power as far as influencing what was played on the radio, as, black music became more popular, other major labels were stepping in, and so, Jack the Rapper's concerns were just about how do we preserve black music, how do we preserve, black radio, and so he commented a lot, criticized a lot of the industry, including, black record companies and artists, because he saw infiltration and change there as well. So he's pretty outspoken about that as far as how it was a little bit more black and white. In other words, as far as how he thought, the black music industry should be operated in order to preserve things. And, which is, I think during the times, this is right in the heart of the civil rights movement. So, there's a push to, advance black Americans economically and socially. And I think, for him, being heavily tied in the civil rights movement, there was, there are various, of course, segments who believed different things about how to achieve this, and in his view, it was more about preservation and keeping things intact, and allowing white professionals to come into the black space was going to result in similar ways that they saw, in other instances where white people with money came into the scene and kind of slowly changed the landscape, and which was already happening. And I think not only that, but his concerns about just in specific to black record companies, even the independent small black record companies, and how they use their language. Like, he did not like when people would refer to black radio as urban radio, because he felt that, just was a umbrella term that didn't really speak to, what black radio represented historically and what should represent. So that was him. He was, outspoken throughout his career. And then in 1977 was when he first began hosting the first Family Affair convention, which you may or may not have heard of, since it existed into fairly recent, which is as recent as in the 90s. And so the convention started off as a gathering of, just professionals in the field. He wanted it to be like a place where people could network, where people who were interested in getting into black radio or black entertainment could attend seminars. A lot of people will say that the convention was more or less always kind of a party atmosphere, but it was definitely intended to be a place where people were able to kind of get educated, get support, and enter the career or enter the field. But as time went on, it definitely became became a little conflated as far as it being just a convention and a party, because it really grew and grew. You eventually have hip hop coming in and bringing in that new wave of musicians and entertainers and professionals. So it just kept growing and growing, and eventually live performances were happening, and it became a place where a lot of people were just newer acts were trying to, it was a rare opportunity where they were able to directly engage with some of the established stars and successful producers and entertainers in the field. So it was an important place where younger acts could get validated, but some of the growth was not, it was not consistent with the convention's, initial goals, and eventually, that became an issue, which I'll talk about in a second. But in 1987, Jack the Rapper got word of that Jackie Wilson was buried in an unmarked grave, and we'll talk about Jackie Wilson later in the timeline. But it's just something to note as we're kind of going through his life. So it was a pretty big deal at the time. They found this out because Jackie Wilson, of course, a legend. So they started a fundraiser, and they were able to build a nice, proper gravesite for him and, I believe, Jackie Wilson's mother. And that's a theme that I'll probably talk about more with Jackie Wilson, is there were a number of early black artists that were placed in, that were just in unmarked graves, and I think to some degree it's not unexpected, I don't think, or a surprise, just because of the way, some of these artists were, may or may not have gained mainstream popularity, but they definitely, I think it's pretty well documented and well known that these artists were not compensated in a way that was comparable to other people in the industry. So now we're talking about back to the Family Affair. So now at this point, in the 1980s, 1990s, hip hop is, growing and growing. And so that brought in, new attendees to the convention, and, there were just rising issues that were happening, just because within hip hop, especially early hip hop, there were sort of factions, and different record companies had beef with other record companies. That was part of the culture in certain areas of hip hop, and so they were having issues of vandalism and some fights. And so a lot of the hosts of the convention, it was originally being hosted in Atlanta, and people were just getting concerned. And so when some of these fights and some of these issues came up, the hosts were starting to get really iffy, and I think they were also just iffy about kind of the overall general reputation that some of hip hop had, as far as bringing in unwanted trouble. Just looking at some of the concerts and stuff. So how valid that was kind of a non-issue, because stuff was happening at the convention, and eventually they did move it to Miami. I know specifically there was it was between Death Row Records and Skywalker Records. There was kind of a beef there that apparently spilled over at one of the conventions, and that was kind of one of the landmark situations that kind of marked the slow decline, or kind of marked it. The writing was on the wall at that point, where the convention was going to only be around for so long. But they attempted to move it to Orlando, at a different location where there was less concern. But I think it was in 1996, 1997. Things were just getting a little bit too rough and rowdy, and so that was when the Family Affair convention unfortunately ceased to exist. But as you can see, we're talking about all the way into the 90s, late 90s, for a guy that was part of the early days of black radio. Joseph Deighton Gibson Jr. He really spanned across and helped influence and proliferate, a number of artists and genres along the way, and really influenced and impacted the industry. And I think it really speaks, when you talk about all of the Black DJs, from, basically Al Benson, Nat D. Williams, and Jack the Rapper, you get into not only the popularization of the R&B and black music at the time, but you also get into what were the foundations of rap, because we already talked a little bit about the speaking style of Black DJs and kind of just the flow, and kind of just really building up basically what the MC was at the time. And if you think about what the MC became at hip hop concerts, there's a lot of similarity there. The style kind of gets extended, but even if you're just talking about rap and hip hop, there were of course there were rapping DJs early on, or you can say spoken word DJs, however you want to phrase it. But another factor was that for WRD in Atlanta, and of course more specifically when Jack the Rapper was in Miami. So the Miami airwaves, specifically at night when specifically at night the airwaves were more open, and I think you were required to have a special license to broadcast at night, and so there were limited stations that were broadcasting at night, and so during those times the stations could be picked up further away, and so people in the Caribbean could hear what Jockey Jack was playing, and some of those stations were playing, and that was one of the main ways that music was transferred to the Caribbean, and just hearing the DJs and whatnot was a big influence on the Caribbean. Of course, for those of you that know, that was many people who came from the Caribbean were heavy creators in the sound of hip hop. So yeah, Black DJs, Black radio was a big influence in multiple ways in the evolution of music, for sure, and something that I think people definitely give credit for, especially when you think about the DJs closer up to hip hop. Just thinking about a lot of the people who were DJs and just acquired, like an 808 or a mixer, and were making tracks that way, and kind of just transferred straight from a sort of DJ into being a hip hop MC, but also just the style, the distribution of music that hadn't been heard, so a wider audience, and influencing future musicians and future DJs in taking that up, and further evolving the craft, and revolutionizing American music. So it's they get credit, but I think sometimes people just don't go far enough back and really consider the evolution, and to see the totality of the impact that black radio and radio DJs had on hip hop and rap. So those are all the DJs, at least formally speaking, that are on the timeline. Next on the timeline is Rudy Toombs, and so now we're really in the heart of R&B. We're in the 1940s, late 1940s, early 1950s. And so when you listen to music written by Rudy Toombs or some of these later artists, it's pretty clearly R&B, although some of them kind of border on rock and roll, and some of them are really blues. So once again, still murky, but you can definitely hear that it's kind of evolved from jump blues, at least, or moved on from jump blues, I should say. So Rudy Toombs grew up in Harlem. He was a tap dancer in the 1930s, and he tried his hand at different performing roles, and eventually he decided to become a songwriter, which was the right move for him. I think he became like a very prolific songwriter. He has over 200 songs that have been documented that he was written. But specifically, he was included in the timeline because of his work with Ruth Brown. He wrote "Teardrops from My Eyes," which was a very well-known, famous song by Ruth Brown, and also early R&B. It topped the charts, and he also wrote 5, 10, 15 Hours, which was also one of Ruth Brown's early hits. He wrote some other songs plenty of songs that were hits. One interesting thing is he wrote One Mint, what is it called? One Mint Julep. He wrote that song for the Clovers, and 5, 10, 15 Hours was released in 1952, and that song was also released in 1952. And the only reason that both songs, One Mint wasn't number one on the charts was because 5, 10, 15 Hours was at the number one spot, so he would have potentially had 2 number one spots in 1952. And so that kind of just shows how prolific of a songwriter he was. So he wrote more songs for the Clovers. He also wrote for a number of artists. He wrote for some hits for Louis Jordan, the Five Keys, Joe Turner, Freddie King, Little Willie John. So he's probably one of the greater songwriters in the history, especially during this time. Doesn't really get heard a lot. Ruth Brown is very well known, and we'll talk about her in a second. But as far as Rudy Toombs, I think a lot of times, of course, songwriters kind of get pushed in the background. But the reason he was on this timeline was just because of his kind of background influence on a number of artists in the R&B genre, specifically Ruth Brown. And unfortunately, he in 1962 he was in Harlem, and he got mugged and beaten, got beat up at the time, and the injuries, he had got brain damage, and he died shortly after. So his career was also cut short, unfortunately. So even though Ruth Brown is, I guess technically, she's on the timeline, she's mentioned, as the singer of Rudy Toombs songs on the timeline. And as I've said before, I try to give as much credit to the songwriters as possible, and people who really kind of were at the foundation of some of these genres and musical styles. It's not always the case, but at the same time, the reason it was Ruth Brown is because Ruth Brown is one of the best singers in history, and she also had an influence after her music career as well. So I'm not gonna get too much into Ruth Brown's history, but I couldn't just mention Rudy Toombs without mentioning and going over Ruth Brown. Her background was in she was singing spirituals. That's where she started out, and she was a balladeer. She was one of the most popular R&B artists in the 1950s. Of course, as I said before, Rudy Toombs wrote her songs Tears from My Eyes in 5, 10, 15 Hours, which were some of her first hits, not necessarily her biggest hits, but some of her first hits, and big R&B artist. And as things kind of shifted a little bit more to rock and roll, she kind of transitioned a little bit more to like a pop, like swing roll, and continued her career for a while there. And specifically, one thing, a famous quote from Ruth Brown was, because if you listen to some of her songs, they really sound like rock and roll. You could definitely make the argument that they are very rock and roll-esque, and I think when you listen to a number of R&B songs during that time period, it's hard to differentiate them between rock and roll. Like if someone called it rock and roll, you probably wouldn't disagree, especially if you are listening to modern R&B. Like if you take a modern R&B song, from like the 90s or later, or even the 80s or later, and you compare it to a Ruth Brown song, and you say, does this sound more like rock and roll or R&B? I think a lot of people would choose rock and roll, but it's up for debate, but something to consider. But one of her famous quotes, she was asked by a journalist, when did rhythm and blues become rock and roll? And she said, when the white kids started dancing to it. And that statement, I think, is something that kind of reflects the music industry through the entire span. Just because, as we talked about with the genres, the genres kind of evolved as, the marketing was appropriate. And so, the rock and roll genre kind of evolved and shifted and became a completely separate genre as the market seemed appropriate. And not necessarily by style, even though, I think there's no doubt that, as rock and roll evolved, it has a clear delineated style, and of course we have all these subgenres of rock that are clearly rock. So, I think it's an important quote just to consider, like, socially and culturally, and just kind of when you take a step back and look at, the timeline and the music, it kind of, it makes sense, for her perspective. And then in the 1980s, she got into a legal suit with Atlantic Records to try to get some of her royalties back. Atlantic Records, of course, was where she released most of her biggest hits in the 1950s. And, this was kind of a general theme, is, a lot of musicians, pre-1950s especially, they were just trying to break into the industry, especially with some of the backgrounds, if you're coming from impoverished backgrounds, or, where a situation where this is make or break, this is, really your only avenue for where you can get some sort of, economic success. A lot of these musicians were just more or less being taken advantage of. At very least, they were not being paid as you would pay a mainstream artist. So it was a big issue for a lot of black musicians, and it was kind of a landmark case for Ruth Brown to successfully take on Atlantic Records to get some of her royalties back, even though, I think it's pretty consensus that she didn't get enough, but it's a win regardless. And that battle and some of the money related to it, there was seed money related to that, $1.5 million, that allowed her to help start the Rhythm and Blues Foundation, which was to support some of the older musicians who had been around and kind of gone through the same thing. And it was also to provide, just general financial support and basic benefits for just, artists from the present, moving forward. So that was, a contribution by her after, her music career. But, that's really Ruth Brown in a nutshell. Like I said, don't get too in depth with her. But her music will be on the timeline as well. And, just listening through her whole music catalog, she's one of the better vocalists of in music history. Next and last on the timeline, for this episode at least, is Riley B. King, also known as B.B. King. He was born in Mississippi, and his parents were sharecroppers. When he was young, 5 years old, B.B. King's mother moved away with B.B. King to the Delta region of Mississippi, and during that time he was, exposed to a lot of religious community, faith-based communities, spirituals, and so that was kind of an early musical influence. His uncle reportedly played guitar at a church while he preached, so that would have been early exposure to guitar. And so when B.B. King's mom was, when B.B. King was around 10, his mother passed away, and as legend has it, I haven't really heard anything specifically, many sources specifically speaking about this portion of his life. It's not that there's conflicting stories, but supposedly, when his mother died when he was 10, he basically lived alone in their cabin on the plantation for a few years, until he was working on the plantation a little bit as well. until he had enough money to get a guitar. And at that point, he was able to learn from his cousin Bucka White, and for almost a year, and then he went on to play on street corners and small gigs until he was able to get substantial work. And once he moved to Memphis, after a while, he was able to work for WDIA, which was where Nat D. Williams was working, as I kind of mentioned before. And when he first got there, it was really just to play live on-air covers. He would have like a 10-minute spot he'd be able to play, and eventually they hired him as a DJ, and that was where he got the name Beale Street Blues Boy, which was shortened to Blues Boy or B.B. King. And in the 1950s, he signed with Modern Records. His cover, 3 O'Clock Blues, which was originally written by Lowell Fulson. That was kind of his first hit, brought him some a lot of recognition, and from there on, continued to record a lot of other hit songs. And in 1969, he recorded a hit, The Thrill's Gone, which was originally written by Roy Hawkins. And Roy Hawkins was actually at the same label, so he actually was aware of the original Thrill's Gone. If you listen to the original by Roy Hawkins, it's pretty much kind of a standard slow blues song, and of course B.B. King's song is a lot more produced, and it's a little bit more up-tempo, and of course modern with B.B. King's modern playing style. And it's interesting that he covered 3 O'Clock Blues by Lowell Fulson, because Lowell Fulson, along with like T-Bone Walker, was they were like some of the primary originators of like the West Coast blues style, which was pretty electric blues focused. So you can definitely see the influence, and you can see how he was kind of picking out these songs. B.B. King had a really good way of taking covers or making really successful covers of previously released songs. Some of them were hits, some of them were not. And of course, other piece of him was just his playing style. I know I heard in an interview with Buddy Guy, Buddy Guy really credits B.B. King with bending, string bending, and utilizing that in lieu of slide, essentially, or just as a style of playing within the electric blues, which I don't know. I don't know if he's necessarily the first person to do that. I think he's definitely probably one of the more prolific person to do it, or really to lean in on it. I'm not really familiar with where specifically. I know I've heard artists before B.B. King do it, but I don't know, there's so much crossover. I don't know who was actually the first person to really implement that fully into their style. But that's definitely one thing that stands out in B.B. King's style. And of course, another thing that always stands out is his a very distinct tenor voice, really good voice, and that kind of also set him apart. So that is B.B. King, and that's about it for this episode. As always, thanks for listening. Keep tuning in. At this point, I guess we're about almost halfway through the timeline, and continue to delve into some of these R&B and, you know, kind of transforming from R&B to rock and roll. I think as we started this episode talking about R&B, it's interesting because you look at Ruth Brown, her songs could be pretty much categorized as rock and roll, or some of them at least. And with B.B. King, of course, he's an electric blues guy, and so, you know, but his hits would have been released on the R&B charts. So, you know, it's just, you know, I think it kind of plays into how we started the episode. It's just, you know, interesting to think about, I guess. I don't know how much it matters, you know, in the grand scheme of things, but it kind of shows, you know, why these different points were highlighted on the timeline, and it's just food for thought, really, as we continue to discuss some of these different artists and the genres they played, and, you know, how they were categorized, and the entire evolution of blues, R&B, rock and roll, funk, and hip hop. So tune in next time. You know, I think it's, you know, we're getting closer and closer. You know, some of these individuals lived on till recently. You know, I think B.B. King is one of the few people on the timeline, you know, during this time period that I was able to see live. So, you know, it's interesting over the scope, you know, and the evolution of music, how recent it kind of feels as you kind of go over all this timeline. You know, the 1920s and the beginning of blues might feel a long time ago, but as you kind of, you know, look at the evolution and see, you know, when these individuals were born and when they passed away, and how some of them are still around, and how the influence and network and, you know, this timeline kind of is made up of a, you know, pretty closely related community. You know, like everyone kind of may have worked or influenced each other, you know, if not directly, you know, they were able to directly witness them, you know, see them live. So, you know, kind of really puts it all in perspective. You know, it seems like a long time ago, but, you know, in a lot of ways it's very recent. So, thanks for tuning in. I'll see you all next time. Until then, take care.